The letter I found in my wife's music box on the morning of her funeral was only the beginning. Protect the truth, even if it hurts. For me, for her, those trembling words would haunt me for years, until I discovered my daughter had embezzled $80,000 from the company I built with my bare hands to fund her fairy tale wedding. But when I confronted her, my own child looked me in the eye and called me a senile old man. She threatened to have me declared incompetent when I caught her stealing. That's when I finally understood what my late wife had foreseen, what she knew would one day need protecting. The truth about our family was far more devastating than I could have imagined. What would you do if the person you loved most betrayed you in the worst possible way? Follow this story to witness the moment when police officers walk into an engagement party and change everyone's lives forever. This isn't just about money stolen. It's about secrets buried for decades. About a daughter who isn't who she thinks she is, and a father forced to make the hardest choice imaginable. Subscribe now, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. I found the letter inside her music box on the morning of her funeral. There was no melody when I opened it, just her handwritten words staring back at me. Protect the truth, even if it hurts. For me, for her. Her handwriting trembled on the page and I trembled with it. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 67 years old, and I lost my life partner to a merciless cancer that ate away at her body for 18 months. I watched her fade day by day, holding her hand as she grew thinner, weaker, until she was just a whisper of the woman I'd loved for 43 years. I thought nothing could destroy me more than that slow goodbye. I was wrong. The letter stayed locked away for years after that, its meaning a mystery. Just another piece of Margaret to hold on to. Like her reading glasses I couldn't bring myself to throw away, or the lavender perfume I sometimes sprayed on her pillow just to pretend she was still there. Until 3 months ago when I discovered that my only daughter, Heather, the apple of my eye, the girl I'd taught to ride a bike down Cedar Lane, the young woman I'd helped move into her college dorm at Clemson, had embezzled $80,000 from the metalworking business I'd built with my own 2 hands, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. She took it to pay for a fairy tale wedding to a man who could barely look me in the eye when we shook hands. A man who drove a car that cost more than my first house but somehow couldn't contribute to their dream celebration. "Daddy," she said when I confronted her in my office, spreadsheets scattered across my desk. "It's just an emotional loan." She smiled that smile, the one that used to melt my heart when she was 7 and wanted ice cream before dinner. But I wasn't melting anymore. I was freezing over, watching her explain away theft like it was borrowing a sweater. "I was going to pay it back," she continued, examining her manicure. "The business is half mine anyway. Mom would have wanted me to have a perfect wedding." When I told her that her mother would be ashamed, something changed in her eyes. Something cold. Something I'd never seen before. "You're getting old, Dad," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe it's time we discussed power of attorney. My lawyer thinks you might be showing signs of cognitive decline." She threatened to have me declared incompetent. My own daughter, the girl who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read her stories about brave princesses. That night, alone in my house that suddenly felt too big and too empty, I remembered Margaret's letter, and I finally understood what my wife had foreseen all those years ago. The truth she knew would one day need protecting, and God, did it hurt, like a knife between my ribs, twisting with every breath. I sat on our back porch, the one I'd built when Heather was just a toddler, where Margaret and I used to watch fireflies on summer evenings, and I cried like I hadn't since the day they lowered my wife into the ground at Oakwood Cemetery. Because the truth was, our perfect family wasn't so perfect after all, and the daughter I'd raised wasn't really the person I thought she was. But I still had no idea that the cruelest blow would come at her engagement party, when the police would walk in with a warrant, and he would be there too, the man from Margaret's past, the man whose existence was hinted at in another letter, in another box, hidden even deeper than the first. I remember staring at my reflection in the window that night, the porch light illuminating my weathered face, and asking myself a question that would haunt me for months. What would Margaret want me to do now? The answer came in her voice, clear as day, as if she were sitting beside me in her favorite wicker chair. "Protect the truth, Walter, even when it hurts." So I picked up the phone and made the call that would change everything. Because sometimes loving someone means doing the hardest thing imaginable. Sometimes it means choosing justice over peace. And sometimes it means watching the person you love most in the world walk away in handcuffs, hating you with every fiber of their being. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back to the beginning, to how the business I built with blood and sweat became the instrument of my daughter's betrayal, and how a mother's final words became a father's impossible choice. I opened Hensley Metalworks in Greenville, South Carolina, back in 1983. It wasn't much to look at then, just an old garage with a rusty overhead door, a second-hand lathe, and my calloused hands. The sign was hand-painted on a piece of plywood, custom metal fabrication and repair. I'd spent 15 years working for other men, watching my ideas make them rich while I took home just enough to keep our little family afloat. Margaret believed in me when the bank didn't. She cashed in her grandmother's bonds, her only inheritance, and handed me $6,400 to buy the equipment I needed to start. I can still see her standing in that empty garage on the day we signed the lease, her auburn hair catching the light through the dirty windows. "This is going to be something special, Walter," she'd said, squeezing my hand. "I can feel it." And it was. For 30 years, I bent metal and shaped steel, turning raw materials into precise, beautiful things. I built railings for the First Baptist Church, custom gates for the old mansions on Augusta Road, decorative pieces for the downtown revitalization project. My hands bled into that business, literally sometimes, when a sharp edge caught me unaware or a hot weld splattered. Every scar on these old hands tells a story of building something that would outlast me. The shop smelled of metal dust and machine oil. I'd come home with it clinging to my clothes, embedded in the creases of my skin. Margaret never complained, just laid out old towels by the back door for me to wipe my boots on. When my heart started acting up 5 years ago, minor attack, the doctors called it, though it felt like an elephant sitting on my chest, I knew it was time to step back. Heather had just finished her MBA at Clemson, all bright-eyed with new ideas about marketing and expansion. She'd grown up watching me work, though she never showed much interest in actually learning the trade itself. "The future is in management, Dad," she'd say. "Let me handle the business side so you can focus on what you love, the metal work." It sounded perfect. She'd take over the front office, handling clients and paperwork, while I stayed in the workshop doing what I knew best. Margaret had just gotten her diagnosis by then. Stage 3, they said, with a grim look that told us what the odds were. I was distracted, worried, too busy taking Margaret to chemo appointments and researching experimental treatments to notice what was happening at the shop. For a while, things seemed to be going well. Heather digitized all our records, set up a website, even got us some contracts with bigger clients. Revenue was up. She talked about hiring more craftsmen, expanding into architectural metals for the luxury home market. I was proud and relieved that the business I'd built would continue after I was gone. Then came the day I found a receipt from Low Country Wedding Consultants in the shop's expense file. Must be a mistake, I told myself, filing it away to ask Heather about later. But I never did ask. There was always something more urgent. Margaret's declining health, a rush order for a client, the new apprentice who needed training. It wasn't until after the funeral, after I'd started coming back to the shop more regularly to escape the silence of our empty house, that I noticed other things. Duplicate invoices, phantom services, receipts for materials we never ordered, and my signature, forged with remarkable precision, on checks I'd never seen. I called our accountant, Jim Pearson, same man who'd been doing our taxes since 1990, and asked him to come by after hours. He spread everything out on my workbench, the leather patches on the elbows of his tweed jacket catching on the rough wood as he leaned forward, pointing to discrepancies. "I wondered about some of these," he admitted, not meeting my eyes. "But Heather said you were authorizing everything, that you were distracted by grief. I didn't want to bother you." The total made my stomach drop. $79,142.19 and siphoned off over 12 months. Almost $80,000. Money that could have kept the shop running for another year, paid the medical bills that were still coming in, secured the retirement Margaret and I had planned before cancer stole her away. When I confronted Heather in my office, the same small room where I'd taught her to draw her first letters at the desk while I did paperwork, she didn't deny it. Her eyes, so like her mother's, didn't show a trace of shame. "It's just an emotional loan, Daddy," she said, perched on the edge of my desk in a suit that probably cost more than I made in a month. "The business is doing great. Besides, half of it will be mine someday anyway." "That's not how business works, Heather," I said. my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. That's theft. From the company. From me. She sighed dramatically. Mom would have wanted me to have a beautiful wedding. She always talked about how she wished you could have afforded more than that courthouse ceremony and potluck reception. That hit me like a physical blow. Margaret and I had married young and poor, yes, but she'd never once complained about our simple wedding. We'd celebrated every anniversary like it was more precious than the last. Your mother would be ashamed of what you've done, I said quietly. Something flickered across Heather's face then, a coldness I'd never seen before. You're getting old, Dad, she said, her voice dropping. Maybe it's time we discussed power of attorney. My lawyer thinks you might be showing signs of cognitive decline. Those words chilled me to the bone. My own daughter, threatening to have me declared incompetent because I'd caught her stealing. And what hurt worse was when I called my sister-in-law, Margaret's older sister Diane, thinking she'd be as outraged as I was. Instead, she sighed and said, "She's young, Walter. You're being selfish. This is just a father who doesn't want to let his daughter fly." That's when I knew I was truly alone. The family I thought I had, the support system I'd counted on, wasn't there. Or worse, they were taking Heather's side. I went home that night to an empty house full of memories and ghosts. And as I sat on our back porch watching the fireflies blink in the gathering dusk, I finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell me in that letter. The truth was painful, but it needed to be protected, even if it meant losing the only family I had left. I spent 3 days in a fog after that confrontation with Heather. The business I'd built with my own hands now felt like a prison, trapping me in a daily routine of nodding politely to my own daughter, while she continued running the company as if nothing had happened. I caught her watching me sometimes, a calculating look in her eyes that made my skin crawl. Was she already making arrangements with lawyers, planning how to push me out completely? On the 4th morning, I woke before dawn with Margaret's voice echoing in my head. Protect the truth. It had become a mantra, repeating itself in the quiet moments, but I still didn't fully understand what truth she'd been so concerned about. I dragged myself out of bed and shuffled to the bathroom. The face in the mirror looked like a stranger. Hollowed cheeks, dark circles under bloodshot eyes, 3 days of white stubble. I barely recognized myself. "You look like hell, Walter," I muttered. After a shower that didn't wash away the weight on my shoulders, I found myself drawn to Margaret's side of the bedroom. I'd left it untouched since she passed, her reading glasses still on the nightstand, her favorite cardigan draped over the chair in the corner, her nighttime moisturizer that smelled of lavender still sitting on the dresser. I sat on the edge of her bed, running my hand over the quilt her mother had made for our 20th anniversary. The familiar pattern of blues and creams brought a lump to my throat. Then my eyes drifted to the nightstand drawer, the one place I hadn't looked through since she died. It had felt too personal somehow, too intimate. But now, something pulled me toward it. The drawer slid open with a familiar squeak. Inside were the items of her private life: a small devotional book, some costume jewelry she rarely wore, a tube of cherry-flavored lip balm, a small notebook where she'd jotted down quotes that moved her. And there, tucked in the very back corner, was an envelope I'd never seen before. It was sealed with a small piece of tape, bearing a handwritten label in Margaret's elegant script, "Only if she breaks you." My hands trembled as I carefully peeled back the tape. Inside were 2 items: a folded document that looked official and a small note card in Margaret's handwriting. The note read simply, "If she uses you, reveal the truth, but only if absolutely necessary," because this truth could destroy her. I unfolded the document with a growing sense of dread. It was a DNA test from Southeastern Medical Laboratory, dated May 17, 1992. Just a few months after Heather was born. The result was highlighted in yellow. Probability of paternity, 0%. The room seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of the nightstand to steady myself, breathing in short, shallow gasps as the implications crashed over me like ice water. Heather wasn't my biological daughter. Memories flashed through my mind in rapid succession. Margaret's extended research trip to Atlanta while I was working on a 6-month contract in Pittsburgh. Her tearful reunion when I returned, her announcement just weeks later that we were expecting the child we'd been trying to have for years, my unquestioning joy, the beautiful baby girl with auburn hair like her mother's that I'd held in my arms at Baptist Memorial Hospital. I'd never once suspected, not once in 34 years. I sat there for what felt like hours, The paper trembling in my hands, tears sliding down my face and dripping onto the test results, blurring the ink. A lifetime of memories. Teaching Heather to ride a bike down our tree-lined street, helping her with science fair projects, driving her to prom in my freshly washed pickup truck, beaming with pride at her college graduation, all viewed through this new, devastating lens. She wasn't mine, at least not by blood. Yet in every way that mattered, in every memory that counted, she was my daughter. I had raised her, loved her, sacrificed for her. I had been her father in all the ways that truly mattered. But she had stolen from me, threatened me, called me a senile old man when I caught her. I collapsed back onto Margaret's side of the bed, clutching the test results to my chest, and sobbed like a child. The weight of this secret, carried by Margaret for decades and now transferred to me, felt unbearable. Why had she kept this from me? Why reveal it now when she was gone and couldn't explain or comfort or guide me through this impossible situation? What do I do with this, Margaret? I whispered into the empty room. What am I supposed to do now? As if in answer, a beam of morning sunlight broke through the curtains, illuminating the note card that had fallen to the floor. I picked it up, reading the words again. If she uses you, reveal the truth, but only if absolutely necessary, because this truth could destroy her. Something inside me hardened and softened simultaneously. The pain was still there, raw and pulsing, but alongside it grew a resolve I hadn't felt since Margaret's diagnosis. I carefully folded the test results and note, placing them back in the envelope. Then I did what I should have done days ago. I gathered all the evidence of Heather's embezzlement, the forged checks, the duplicate invoices, the falsified purchase orders, and drove to the Greenville County Sheriff's Office. The deputy who took my statement was young, probably no older than Heather, with kind eyes that didn't judge an old man for turning in his own daughter. "This must be very difficult, Mr. Hensley," she said, organizing the papers into a neat file folder. "It's the hardest thing I've ever done," I admitted, my voice cracking. "But sometimes doing the right thing hurts worse than doing the wrong one." She nodded, understanding beyond her years. "We'll need to investigate, of course, but with this documentation, there will most likely be a warrant issued." "How long?" I asked. "A few days, maybe a week. These cases can be complicated." I nodded, feeling both relief and dread coiling in my stomach. "And when the warrant comes, we'll pick her up. Do you know where she'll be?" That's when I remembered the thick cream envelope that had arrived in yesterday's mail, the one I'd tossed aside unopened because it bore Heather's return address. "Yes," I said slowly. "I believe I do." As I drove home, the sky opened up in one of those sudden summer thunderstorms that crash through the south without warning. I could barely see through the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge. It felt appropriate. The heavens themselves seemed to be weeping for what was to come. When I got home, I opened Heather's envelope with steady hands. Inside was an invitation, printed on heavy cardstock with gold foil lettering. "Mr. and Mrs. Richard Campbell cordially invite you to celebrate the engagement of their daughter, Heather Lorraine, to Mr. Jason Michael Edwards." The date was set for the following Saturday at the Prime Church downtown. Just enough time for the warrant to be processed. Just enough time for me to make the hardest decision of my life. The engagement party was held at Prime Church's reception hall, right in the heart of downtown Greenville. It was a stately place, with white columns, burgundy carpet, and tables arranged as if for a royal banquet. Crystal chandeliers hung from the coffered ceiling, casting a warm glow over the gathering of Greenville's upper crust. Doctors, lawyers, business owners, and local politicians who'd come to celebrate the union of two prominent families. I arrived 30 minutes late, deliberately. My hands had been shaking so badly I couldn't knot my tie properly, and I'd had to start over 3 times. Finally, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom, the same mirror where Margaret had straightened my collar countless times over the years, and took a deep breath. "This is the right thing," I whispered to my reflection. "The only thing." The church parking lot was full when I arrived, forcing me to park on the street half a block away. The short walk felt like miles. Each step carried me closer to a confrontation I'd never imagined having to face. My chest felt tight, my mouth dry. Part of me wanted to turn around, drive home, and pretend none of this was happening. But Margaret's voice kept me moving forward. "Protect the truth, even if it hurts." When I entered the reception hall, the party was already in full swing. A jazz trio played softly in the corner. Waiters in black ties circulated with trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Laughter and conversation filled the air with a cheerful buzz. No one greeted me. Heather's friends, young professionals with expensive watches and practiced smiles, gave me a wide berth pretending not to see me. The parents of Jason, Heather's fiancé, huddled together with another couple, whispering and glancing in my direction. So she'd told them I was losing my mind perhaps, that I was jealous of her happiness, that I couldn't let go. I stood alone by a column, nursing a club soda, watching Heather work the room. She was radiant in a cream-colored cocktail dress that probably cost more than a month's worth of mortgage payments on our first house. Her auburn hair, so like her mother's, was swept up in an elegant twist. She laughed and touched arms and accepted congratulations with the ease of someone born to move in these circles. Then I noticed the man officiating the ceremony, a distinguished-looking gentleman with silver hair and a confident smile, wearing an expensive suit with a judge's pin on his lapel. Heather led him around, introducing him to various guests as a dear family friend, but I had never seen him before. Or had I? Something about his profile, the way he carried himself, felt vaguely familiar, like a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite recall. Heather finally made her way to me, her smile tight and her eyes wary. She kissed my cheek, a performance for anyone watching. "I'm glad you came, Dad," she said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I wasn't sure you would." "I wouldn't miss it," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. She gestured to the silver-haired man beside her. "This is Judge Edward Collins. He'll be officiating at the wedding." "Judge Collins, this is my father, Walter Hensley." The judge extended his hand, his grip firm and confident. "A pleasure to meet you, Walter. Heather speaks highly of you." I doubted that very much, but I shook his hand and nodded. "Nice to meet you, Your Honor. Have we met before?" "You look familiar." Something flickered across the judge's face, too quick to identify, before he smiled again. "I don't believe so, though I've been on the bench in Greenville County for nearly 20 years. Perhaps you've seen me in the courthouse." "Perhaps," I said, though I knew that wasn't it. As Heather led the judge away to meet other guests, I noticed a young man moving through the crowd, camera in hand. The photographer, probably in his early 20s with dark-rimmed glasses and an observant gaze, was capturing candid shots of the party. Unlike the other vendors who remained professionally invisible, this young man seemed deeply engaged, studying faces as much as compositions. As he passed by me, the photographer paused, glancing from me to Heather, who was now across the room with the judge. He leaned in slightly and spoke in a low voice. "You're Heather's father? She looks like the judge, don't you think?" The words hit me like a physical blow. I turned to look at him, but he was already moving away, camera raised to capture another moment. I felt myself swaying slightly, and I gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. My eyes darted across the room to where Heather stood beside Judge Collins. For the first time, I truly looked at them together. The same high cheekbones, the same slight dimple in the left cheek when they smiled, the same graceful hands gesturing as they spoke. The room seemed to tilt sideways. How had I never seen it before? Or had I simply refused to see it? The photographer's casual observation had pulled back a curtain I hadn't known was there. I made my way to the restroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at me seemed suddenly older, more fragile. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on me like a physical force. The deputy had called me that morning. "The warrant's been approved, Mr. Hensley. We'll be there tonight around 8. It was 7:45 now. In 15 minutes, police officers would walk through those doors with a warrant for my daughter's arrest. And now, with the photographer's innocent observation echoing in my ears, I understood that the devastation would reach far beyond what I had imagined. I closed my eyes, seeing Margaret's face as she had looked on the day Heather was born, radiant with love and shadowed with secrets I hadn't been equipped to see. When I returned to the reception hall, Heather was tapping a champagne glass, calling for attention. The room quieted as she ascended a small platform where a microphone stood. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice clear and confident. "Jason and I are so grateful to be surrounded by family and friends as we begin this journey together." She looked around the room, her gaze briefly meeting mine before moving on. "None of this would be possible without the support of family," she continued, her voice taking on a slightly harder edge. "Even my father, who doubted me." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But time has a way of showing who is right. Just then, the double doors at the back of the hall swung open. Two police officers in uniform entered, their faces solemn and purposeful. The moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. The following morning, I returned to my wife's bedroom, the room I still couldn't bring myself to call ours anymore. The revelation at the engagement party had changed everything. I needed answers, and I knew where to look. I methodically went through Margaret's things: photo albums, old letters, recipe books with notes scribbled in the margins. My hands trembled as I pulled out boxes from the back of her closet, carefully labeled by year. Finally, I found what I was looking for: a diary with January 1992 written on the cover in her neat handwriting. The leather binding cracked slightly as I opened it, releasing the faint scent of the lavender perfume Margaret had worn all her life. I sat on the edge of the bed, her side of the bed, and began to read. The early entries were mundane: notes about a cold winter, complaints about the rising cost of heating oil, excitement about the nursery we were preparing, even though we weren't sure if our latest round of fertility treatments would work. Margaret and I had been trying to have a child for 7 years by that point, enduring the monthly cycle of hope and heartbreak that infertile couples know all too well. Then on January 17th, the entries changed. My hands trembled as I read, "Walter is away on that Pittsburgh contract. 6 months is too long to be apart, but the money will help with another round of IVF. I'm trying to stay busy." The research trip to Atlanta was a welcome distraction, though I'm ashamed of how I've been spending my evenings. The loneliness is overwhelming sometimes. The next few entries were vague, filled with references to him and meetings at a hotel bar. My throat tightened as I read between the lines of my wife's carefully coded confessions. Then came the entry that confirmed my worst fears. "I've made a terrible mistake. A moment of weakness has turned into a catastrophe. I'm pregnant, and it can't be Walter's. We haven't been together in months, and the timing lines up perfectly with the other situation. I don't know what to do. I can't lose Walter. He's the love of my life, my rock, but I'm carrying another man's child." My vision blurred with tears. I had to put the diary down for a moment, overwhelmed by the strange mixture of betrayal and compassion washing over me. After all these years, the secret was finally out. Part of me wanted to be angry, to feel the righteous indignation of a wronged husband. But mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the young couple we had been, struggling with infertility and separated by financial necessity. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. The next entry was dated 2 weeks later. I've finally tracked him down. He's a rising star in the local legal community, just as he said. When I told him about the pregnancy, his face went white. He said he couldn't be involved. He has political ambitions, a reputation to protect. He offered money for an arrangement. I refused. This is a child, not a problem to be solved with cash. Then, the entry that broke my heart and healed it simultaneously. Heather was born today. 7 pounds, 4 ounces of perfection. When Walter saw her, something miraculous happened. He looked at this tiny red-faced bundle and fell instantly in love. "She has your hair," he said, touching the wispy auburn curls on her head. Then he took my hand and said the words I'll never forget. "Let's raise her as ours." Just like that. No questions, no blame, no hesitation. Just love. Pure, unconditional love. I closed the diary, my hands shaking. Margaret had written, "Heather was born of a mistake." I was alone, confused, and found comfort with a lawyer who promised support. He never wanted the child but helped financially for a time. Then he disappeared. When Walter returned from his trip and saw the baby, he decided to forgive me. He said, "Let's raise her as our own." And so we did. The lawyer was the judge, the same silver-haired man who would now preside over his biological daughter's wedding, without knowing. Or did he know? The way he had looked at Heather with that mixture of pride and distance, had he somehow kept tabs on her all these years? More memories surfaced. Judge Edward Collins had been in the news frequently during Heather's childhood, a rising star in the Greenville legal community, known for his tough stance on white-collar crime. Had Margaret followed his career from afar? Had she kept this secret even as his face appeared in our local newspaper? I looked at the photo album on Margaret's nightstand, the one she'd kept by her bedside during her illness. I'd never paid much attention to it before, assuming it contained family photos. Now, with new eyes, I opened it. There were the expected photos of Heather growing up, birthday parties, school plays, graduation, but interspersed were newspaper clippings. Collins appointed to circuit court. Judge Collins delivers commencement at Clemson Law. Local judge considered for federal bench. Margaret had been tracking him all along, creating a shadow album of the man who had fathered her child. The final clipping, dated just 2 years ago, showed Collins receiving a community service award. The caption read, "Judge Edward Collins, pictured with his wife Elizabeth, has no children but considers the young lawyers he mentors to be his legacy." No children. The irony was almost too much to bear. I sat in the quiet of Margaret's room, surrounded by the physical evidence of a decades-long deception. But strangely, I didn't feel anger toward my late wife. Instead, I felt a profound sadness for all of us caught in this web. Margaret carrying her secret to the grave. The judge, unknowingly celebrating his daughter's engagement. Heather, about to face public humiliation on 2 fronts. And myself, the father who wasn't a father, yet had loved her as my own from the first moment. What would happen when the truth came out, as it inevitably would now? The police had taken Heather away in handcuffs the night before, amid gasps and horrified whispers from the assembled guests. The judge had rushed to her side, asking what was happening, offering legal assistance as any family friend might. Would the truth destroy him too? His wife? His career? The ripples would extend far beyond our broken family. As I carefully replaced the diary in its box, I noticed another envelope, smaller than the first, tucked inside the cover. It contained a faded Polaroid, Margaret and a much younger Edward Collins, his arm around her shoulders, both smiling at what appeared to be a hotel bar. On the back, in Margaret's handwriting, Atlanta, January 1992, the final piece of the puzzle, the evidence that would either destroy or redeem us all. It was time for the toast. Heather stepped up to the microphone, dressed like a modern princess in her cream designer dress that caught the light from the chandeliers overhead. Her auburn hair was styled in loose waves, and diamond earrings, a gift from Jason's family, sparkled whenever she moved her head. She looked radiant, confident, every inch the successful businesswoman and bride-to-be that she portrayed to the world. "None of this would be possible without the support of family," she said, her voice carrying across the hushed room. Her gaze swept over the guests before landing briefly on me. There was a flash of something in her eyes, not warmth, but a kind of cold triumph. "Even my father who doubted me," she continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. She paused, letting the words hang in the air like a challenge. But time has a way of showing who's right. I felt eyes turning toward me, curious and judgmental. The weight of their stares pressed down on my shoulders as I stood alone near one of the white columns. The evening had taken on a dreamlike quality. The soft jazz music, the clink of crystal glasses, the murmur of conversation all seemed to be happening at a distance, as if I were watching it all through thick glass. It was at that precise moment that the double doors at the back of the reception hall swung open with deliberate force. 2 police officers in crisp blue uniforms entered, their faces solemn and purposeful. The taller one, a woman with short blonde hair and steady eyes, scanned the room until she found Heather at the microphone. The shorter one, a stocky man with a military bearing, positioned himself near the exit. The music stumbled to a halt. Conversations died mid-sentence. All eyes turned to the unexpected intrusion. "Heather Lorraine Campbell," the female officer announced, her voice carrying across the now silent room as she approached the small platform where my daughter stood frozen, microphone still in hand. "You're under arrest on suspicion of embezzlement, document forgery, and corporate fraud." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jason, Heather's fiancé, took a half step forward, his face a mask of confusion. "There must be some mistake," he said, his voice cracking slightly. The officer unfolded a document. "I have a warrant for her arrest, signed by Judge Harrison of the Greenville County Court." Heather's face drained of color. The microphone slipped from her fingers, hitting the wooden platform with a loud thud that echoed through the silent hall. For a moment, she looked like a little girl again, scared, vulnerable, caught in a lie too big to talk her way out of. Then her expression hardened. Her eyes found me across the room, and the look she gave me was pure, undiluted hatred. "You did this," she said, her voice low but carrying in the pin-drop silence. "My own father." I couldn't speak, couldn't move. The weight of what I'd set in motion pressed against my chest like a physical force. She struggled as the female officer approached with handcuffs. "This is ridiculous, Dad, tell them." Tell them this is just a misunderstanding." The guests began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably in their formal attire, uncertain whether to intervene or pretend they weren't witnessing the spectacular implosion of what should have been a joyous occasion. It was then that Judge Collins stepped forward, placing himself between Heather and the officer. "I'm a federal judge," he said, his authoritative voice cutting through the chaos. "I need to see that warrant." The officer handed him the document, which he scanned quickly, his brow furrowing. "This appears to be in order, but surely we can arrange for Ms. Campbell to turn herself in tomorrow. This is her engagement party." "I'm sorry, Your Honor," the officer replied firmly. "We have strict instructions to take her into custody immediately." Heather's eyes darted between the judge and me, desperation replacing the hatred. "Please," she begged. No longer the confident businesswoman, but a frightened young woman facing the consequences of her actions for perhaps the first time in her life. "Please help me." Judge Collins turned to look at Heather, really look at her, perhaps for the first time. I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Did he see himself in her face? The high cheekbones, the slight dimple in the left cheek, the shape of her eyes? "I'll call my colleague, Judge Harrison," he said, pulling out his phone. "We'll sort this out." But as he dialed, Heather suddenly broke away from the officer's loose grip and rushed toward me, her face contorted with rage and fear. "How could you?" she screamed, tears streaming down her face, smearing her perfect makeup. "I'm your daughter." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with irony that only I understood. "I know," I said quietly, my voice barely audible over the commotion. "That's why it had to be me." The officers moved quickly, catching Heather before she could reach me. As they gently but firmly restrained her, she continued to sob and struggle. "Dad," she pleaded, her voice breaking, "don't let them take me." I stood rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to save her from the consequences of her own actions. This was justice, I told myself. This was protecting the truth, as Margaret had asked me to do, but it felt like betrayal. The crowd parted as the officers led Heather toward the exit. Jason followed, bewildered and angry, demanding explanations that no one could give him. Judge Collins was still on the phone, his face pale with concern for a young woman he believed was just a friend's daughter. And then, just as they reached the doors, Heather turned and screamed words that stopped the entire room cold. "He's not even my real father." The accusation echoed off the walls, bouncing back like a physical blow. Judge Collins lowered his phone slowly, his eyes widening. "What did she say?" Someone whispered loudly. Heather, seeing the effect of her words, continued with vicious desperation. "Ask him. He just found out himself. He's getting back at me because he's not my biological father. This is all about his wounded pride." I watched as Judge Collins's face changed, the color draining from it as his eyes darted between Heather and me. There was a question forming there, a terrible suspicion beginning to take root. And in that moment, as the elegant reception descended into chaos, guests whispering, Heather struggling against the officers, Jason looking lost and betrayed, the judge stepped forward and said the words that would change everything. "Wait, I am her father." The room fell silent once more. Every face turned toward the distinguished man in the expensive suit, his silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers. "What did you say?" Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. The judge stood straighter, a look of dawning realization on his face. I'll take responsibility for her, as a family friend." But it was too late. The seed had been planted. The truth, buried for 34 years, was beginning to emerge like a terrible flower, blooming in the worst possible moment in the worst possible way. As they led Heather away, handcuffed and sobbing, Judge Collins and I looked at each other across the devastated remains of the engagement party. Two men who had loved the same woman. Two men who had, in very different ways, been fathers to the same child. The truth had been protected, but at what cost? Judge Edward Collins was taken aside by the officers, his distinguished bearing crumbling as he followed them to a quiet corner of the reception hall. Heather, handcuffed and still crying, looked back at him with a mixture of confusion and desperate hope, as if the man she'd known only as a family friend might somehow save her from this public humiliation. I watched it all unfold in a strange, detached state. The guests were leaving in hushed groups, whispering among themselves, some casting accusing glances in my direction. Jason, Heather's fiancé, stood alone by the abandoned toast table, his face blank with shock, a champagne flute still clutched in his hand like he'd forgotten it was there. The devastation I had caused hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just justice. It was a bomb I had detonated in the middle of dozens of lives. Yet beneath the guilt, I felt something unexpected. Relief. The weight of secrets I'd carried for mere days, secrets Margaret had carried for decades, was finally shifting. After the police led Heather away, I drove home in silence. The house was dark and empty when I arrived, the porch light casting long shadows across the front yard. I sat in my car for a long time, staring at the home where I'd raised a daughter who wasn't biologically mine, built a life with a wife who had carried an impossible secret to her grave. The telephone was ringing when I finally went inside. I let it go to the answering machine, listening as the mechanical voice announced an incoming call, followed by a beep. "Mr. Hensley, this is Edward Collins." The judge's voice sounded different, strained, uncertain. "I need to speak with you. It's urgent. Please call me back at this number." He left his cell phone number and the machine clicked off, leaving me in silence again. I poured myself a finger of bourbon, the good stuff Margaret and I had saved for special occasions, and dialed the number. "Walter?" he answered on the first ring. "Thank you for calling back." "Judge Collins," I said, my voice flat. I had nothing left to give. No anger, no indignation, no energy for confrontation. "Please call me Edward." He paused. "I need to see you. To talk about what happened tonight. About Heather." "I think we've both said enough," I replied. "No," he said firmly. "We haven't even begun to say what needs to be said. I'll come to you, please." I gave him the address, though part of me suspected he already knew it. Margaret had tracked his career. Perhaps he had done the same with her life, our life. 40 minutes later, a sleek black BMW pulled into my driveway. Edward Collins stepped out, still wearing his suit from the party, though his tie was loosened and his silver hair disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. I met him at the door, gesturing wordlessly for him to follow me to the back porch. We sat in the wicker chairs where Margaret and I had spent so many summer evenings, the bourbon bottle and 2 glasses between us. "I knew," he said without preamble, his voice breaking the cricket-filled silence. "I've known about Heather for years." I looked at him sharply. "What?" He nodded, accepting the bourbon I offered. "Not at first. Margaret and I, it was just a week. I was in Atlanta for a legal conference. She was there doing research for her master's thesis. We met at the hotel bar. He took a long sip, wincing as the liquor burned its way down. I was already married, already climbing the judicial ladder. She was beautiful and lonely and so full of life. I gripped my glass tighter, fighting the surge of jealousy that rose in me. Jealousy for something that had happened 35 years ago, with a woman now dead. When she called me months later to tell me she was pregnant, I panicked. Edward continued. I offered money for an abortion. When she refused, I sent checks anyway, to help with expenses. But I made it clear I couldn't be involved. Couldn't risk my career, my marriage. He stared into his glass, shame etched in the lines of his face. Margaret told me you had forgiven her, that you would raise the child as your own, that you were twice the man I would ever be. He looked up at me. She was right. So when did you know? I asked. When did you figure out who Heather was? Edward sighed. She was about 15. I was presiding over a scholarship ceremony at Greenville High. When they called Heather Hensley to the stage, I nearly fell out of my chair. She looked so much like my mother at that age. The same eyes, the same way of holding her head. I knew instantly. And you never said anything? I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. Margaret had made me promise to stay away, he said, his eyes filling with tears. She found me after the ceremony, said you were the father Heather deserved, that I had forfeited any right to claim her by my cowardice. He wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand. She was right about that too. So you watched her grow up from a distance, I said, understanding dawning. He nodded. I kept tabs on her, followed her accomplishments in the local paper, made sure she got into Clemson, pulled some strings with the admissions office, though she was smart enough to get in on her own merits, and when Jason's parents asked me to officiate the wedding, he shook his head. I couldn't say no. It was my one chance to be part of a significant moment in her life. We sat in silence for a while, two aging men contemplating the strange turns life had taken. She's in serious trouble, Walter, Edward finally said. The charges against her are substantial. I know, I replied. She stole from me, forged my signature, threatened to have me declared incompetent when I confronted her. Edward winced. I've failed her as a father in every way that matters. I wasn't there to teach her right from wrong, to show her that actions have consequences. I was there, I said quietly, and she still made those choices. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. You were the man. I was the mistake. The words hung between us in the warm summer night air. From inside the house, the grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Margaret's parents, chimed midnight. What happens now? I asked. I've recused myself from any involvement in her case, of course, but I've arranged for the best defense attorney in the state to represent her. Edward finished his bourbon and set the glass down carefully. And I've told my wife everything. After 35 years of lies, she deserved the truth. I nodded, thinking of Margaret and her diary, her secret album of Judge Edward Collins's life, her final letter urging me to protect the truth. And what about Heather? I asked. Will you tell her who you really are? Edward's shoulders slumped. Would that help her now? Or would it just be another betrayal, another adult who failed her? I had no answer for him. The truth, that precious, painful truth Margaret had wanted me to protect, seemed suddenly more complicated than I had imagined. As Edward left that night, he turned to me on the porch steps. Margaret chose well, he said softly. She chose the better man to be Heather's father. But that forgiveness, if that's what it was, brought me no comfort, because the better man had just sent his daughter to jail, and that forgiveness wasn't his to give. On the last page of my wife's diary, there was a simple phrase written in her delicate handwriting. If she never learned to love, at least she knew she was loved. I didn't attend Heather's trial. I couldn't bear to sit in that courtroom, watching the daughter I had raised face the consequences of her actions, while the biological father who had abandoned her sat on the bench in another courtroom, dispensing justice to others. The irony was too bitter, the pain too raw. Instead, I sold the business. The same metalworking shop that had been the scene of Heather's betrayal became my ticket to a fresh start. A larger manufacturing company had been trying to buy me out for years, and I finally accepted their offer. It was less than the business was worth, but it was enough to start over somewhere else. Somewhere without the weight of memories pressing down on me from every street corner and familiar face. I moved to a small town in Vermont, a place where the fall foliage blazed with colors that reminded me of Margaret's auburn hair. I bought a modest cottage on the edge of town, just enough space for an old man and his regrets. The neighbors were friendly but not intrusive, nodding hello when I collected my mail or shoveled the driveway, but respecting my obvious desire for solitude. 3 months after the move, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. The return address was from the Greenville County Women's Detention Center. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I would find inside. Anger, accusations, more threats perhaps. Instead, there was a single page of notebook paper, the handwriting neat and controlled. Walter, the attorney says I'll likely serve 18 months. The judge was lenient given my cooperation and first-time offender status. Judge Collins recused himself, of course. Everyone at the courthouse whispers when I walk by. I've had a lot of time to think in here, about what I did, about who I am, about the truth that came out at the engagement party. Jason left, called off the wedding the day after my arrest. Can't say I blame him. There's something I need to know. Did you always know? That you weren't my biological father, I mean. Was it all a lie? Every birthday card, every school play you attended, every time you called me your little girl. Was it all just pretending? I need to understand. Heather. I read the letter a dozen times, feeling the weight of each word. She hadn't apologized for what she'd done, but there was something in her tone. A vulnerability, perhaps, that I hadn't seen in her since she was a child. The arrogance was gone, replaced by confusion and hurt. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen, trying to find the right words to respond. How could I explain that being a father had nothing to do with DNA and everything to do with love? How could I make her understand that the betrayal wasn't learning she wasn't biologically mine? It was discovering that the values I thought I had instilled in her hadn't taken root. In the end, I wrote from the heart, Dear Heather, no, I didn't know. Not until I found your mother's letter after you took the money. She left it for me along with the DNA test in case I ever needed to understand the whole truth, as she put it. But here's what I want you to understand. It never mattered. Not once in 34 years did I look at you and see anything but my daughter. Every birthday card was real. Every school play, every dance recital, every skinned knee I bandaged. It was all real. You were, and are, my little girl. What broke my heart wasn't learning about your biological father. It was watching you become someone who could steal from family, forge signatures, and threaten the man who raised you rather than face the consequences of your actions. I've enclosed your mother's diary. The part she wrote when she found out she was pregnant, and her decision to tell me the truth then. Read it. Understand that she loved you enough to be honest with me from the beginning, and I loved you enough to choose to be your father every single day of your life. If you ever want to know your biological father, look in the mirror, because you are the worst of him and the best of me. With love, always, Dad. I sealed the letter along with Margaret's diary in a padded envelope and mailed it the next day. Whether Heather would read it, whether she would understand or care about the truths contained in those pages, I couldn't know. But I had fulfilled Margaret's last request. I had protected the truth, painful as it was. Weeks passed with no response. Then months. Winter settled over Vermont with a quiet intensity, blanketing my little cottage in snow. I spent my days working in a small workshop I'd set up in the garage, creating simple metal sculptures, birds in flight, trees reaching toward the sky, abstract pieces that somehow managed to capture the complicated emotions I couldn't express in words. On Christmas morning, I woke to find a small package on my doorstep. No return address, just my name written in familiar handwriting. Inside was a framed photograph of Heather at about age 7, sitting on my lap in the workshop, both of us covered in metal dust, laughing at something long forgotten. On the back, she had written, "The love is what we do even when it isn't recognized. H." My own words echoed back to me, the words I had written in my letter to her, the philosophy that had guided my life as her father. And in that moment, alone in a small house in Vermont, I repeated the phrase aloud like a daily mantra. The love is what we do, even when it isn't recognized. Because sometimes loving someone means doing the hardest thing imaginable. Sometimes it means choosing justice over peace. And sometimes it means letting go of the person you love most in the world, hoping that one day they'll find their way back to you. Not as the perfect child you once imagined them to be. Not as the flawless parent they needed you to be. But as two imperfect humans bound not by blood but by something far more enduring. The choice to love anyway, despite everything. The truth had hurt, just as Margaret had warned, but it had also finally set us free. In the depths of betrayal, Walter Hensley found an unexpected truth. Sometimes the greatest act of love is choosing justice over peace. What would you have done in his shoes? Would you have protected your child from consequences, even as she betrayed and threatened you? Or would you have made the painful choice to uphold the truth, knowing it might permanently destroy your relationship? The cost of protecting truth is often paid in tears. Walter lost his daughter twice, first to her own greed and deception, and then to the revelation of her true parentage. Yet in that painful space between loss and redemption, he found something precious, the freedom that comes only when we stop living in lies. His story reminds us that being a parent isn't about blood. It's about the choice to love, guide, and sometimes let go. From wherever you're watching this story today, we hope it touched something in your heart. What difficult truth are you protecting in your own life? Share your thoughts in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share it with someone who might need to hear that. Sometimes the hardest choices are the most necessary ones.